Welcome to Technique Tuesday. This is a new series that we're going to be running here on the channel, just going through some of our lifters, the exercise they're doing, and what we can do to improve. As to why we program some of these movements, why we execute them, the way we execute them, and just how we can improve on the lifts that are featured in this video. First up, we've got my client, Thomas. He is currently training to improve his SBD, but in the background, we're looking to improve his body composition as well. Get a bit bigger, get a bit stronger overall. So for him, he is squatting, benching, and deadlifting, but most of his accessory movements are geared towards building as much size as possible. Here we have him executing the seated dumbbell overhead press with a heel reference. Now, with the heel reference, that's essentially just getting your feet elevated and driving your heels into something solid. He's probably got his feet here just on a dumbbell rack. Now, with the heel reference, what we're looking for is a flat back. By driving the heels into the steady support, we're looking to drive a bit of posterior tilt, so the pelvis tucking underneath Thomas. A flat back, so the rib cage is stacked over the pelvis, and then the elbows being slightly in front of the body. All right, so this stacked position and the elbows out in front of the body are probably going to allow for more tension on the target muscles and increased range of motion for the delts. The way that Thomas is doing it, the shoulder blades are pinned back towards each other and he's not got this stacked position. When trying to manage fatigue, especially with squatting, benching, and deadlifting, we want to try and bias positions where we can minimize fatigue to accessory musculature and drive the stimulus towards the target muscle and try to have a very, very isolated stimulus as opposed to something that's a bit drawn out over the body. If it was something like a barbell overhead press or a seated dumbbell overhead press with an arch, the goal is probably to move the biggest weight possible. And an arch is good in this case. Locked back shoulder blades, depressed, retracted upper back, and then pressing, limiting range of motion is going to allow for the biggest weights moved. But again, we're probably going to see the stimulus being spread across not just the shoulders, but some of the passive structures in the shoulders, the lower back, triceps a little bit more, absolutely everything there. So that is why we press like this. So just flattening out the back, getting that posterior tilt is going to allow for better execution of this variation of the shoulder press. Here we have Vic. Vic is training for body composition primarily, but she likes the big lift. So we do have them featured in there. In this phase of training, RDLs were a big focus for her as a main lift. Usually we opt for RDLs over deadlifts off the floor in someone that's trying to, bias strength, but also build a body just because of the eccentric component. What we find is with the eccentric component, it can drive more tension to the target muscles, more tension to the target muscles, more hypertrophy. This is why we've opted for the RDL as Vic's main lift. As you can see, when she starts the eccentric, she breaks a bit quick and she breaks at the knees as well as the hips. Generally, what we recommend is starting with slightly bent knees, slightly flexed knees, and then solely driving hip flexion. So the hips moving back in space, the fold at the hips. What that's going to allow for is tension on the hamstrings and glutes eccentrically. If she breaks at the knees as well as the hips, this is losing some of that tension on the hamstrings and glutes and is driving that tension away from the target muscles that we're looking to bias as much as possible. The first thing that I would cue Vic to do is slow down the eccentric from the top. You can see that she breaks at the hips quite quickly, quite abruptly, and this makes it hard for her to maintain control on the way down. Going that little bit slower makes things a hell of a lot easier, especially when learning a new technique and especially when trying to apply a new cue, a piece of information that your coach has provided you, and then just wrapping your head around a movement as a whole. All right, so that would be the first thing I would say. The second thing is when we lower, we're not looking to lean over, we're not looking to bend down, we're looking to sit our hips back towards the wall behind us. That's going to allow for a greater stretch on the hamstrings and glutes and just more tension on those muscles. Here we have my client Cooper, who is preparing for a mock meet in November. Going through a bench single. Cooper's asked me to destroy his bench press. I don't really think there is too much to destroy. For a single, I do think that we need a different level of sort of focus and intent. We've got one rep, we've got one opportunity to move the biggest weight possible, and that means we've got to have a more efficient technique, a more solid technique that's going to allow us to move the biggest weights. So for that, in the big lifts, it's generally whole body tension that we're looking for. We need to create as much tension through the entire system so that we've got a steady base, essentially, to allow us to move the biggest weights possible. In the bench press, everyone knows that you've got to try and lock the upper back in tight. It's something that's almost less commonly focused on, especially when people start to move into training the big lifts to move the biggest weights possible, is the focus on leg drive and tension throughout the legs. So we'll watch the lift. What we'll see is Cooper sets up, upper back nice and tight, legs are on. As he starts the eccentric, you can see he's starting to tap his feet around. That movement, although it doesn't look like it's too much, is enough to lose tension through the entire system. A lot of people drive through their legs aggressively, and then it really allows for a much better chest position. A lot of people, you see, they lose their bench press not because the weight was too heavy, but because their technique just wasn't there. They misgrooved it off the chest, they lost tension, and then they weren't able to press back to the rack and getting the weight up. All right, so we need to drive as much tension through the entire system, not just the upper back, but the legs as well. Usually with leg drive, I tell people drive as hard as you possibly can into the floor. Try to spread the floor as hard as you can. Once you're driving as hard as you can, go even harder than that, because you'll find a lot of people think they're doing as much as they can through their legs, but they could always do so much more. Can't put enough emphasis on how important it is to get as much out of your lower body in the bench press to get a nice, sturdy position to allow for a better press on the up phase or the concentric. Here we've got my man Chris doing some deads. I know for this video, Chris has put some videos through to me with some better executed deadlifts like this, but for context, he'd come off a little bit of a break. I knew that he wanted to send his dead, so that's why he's coming in a bit more rushed, a bit more aggressive with these ones. You'll see what I mean now with these deads. He's got a great pattern, but you see he just yanks it off the floor a little bit here. Gets that position, hip position's fantastic, upper back position's fantastic, but he yanks the bar off the floor. With a deadlift, people refer to a deadlift as a pull, but as much as it's a pull, I would say it's more of a push. We're pushing our legs through the ground. Yes, we pull the slack out of the bar, but we want to make sure that we're driving our legs through the ground. We treat the deadlift more as a leg press than a pull or a yank. Like I said, Chris's position is actually fantastic. I'm fine with his position, but rather than yank, what I would like him to do is pull the slack out of the bar. I want him to create a bend in the bar to try and drive tension through his upper body before he starts to break the floor. All right. So the sequence, rather than get into position and yank, it would be get into position, create a bend in the bar by pulling the slack out of the bar, and then driving through the legs. If you watch the video again, you'll see that Chris, let's pull it back just a little bit. See, Chris just pulls off the bar. There isn't that sort of precursor before the push. It's that yank. So we need to pull the slack, get that breath in, drive the legs through the floor, and that'll make for a much smoother deadlift, probably leading to more involvement from the lower body and probably a little bit less involvement from muscles in the lower back. Here we've got my client Zoe. She's doing some tempo and pause work for her bench press. We'll see here with her bench press, she's a fantastic eccentric. She's very solid through the legs. Her chest position's great, but we could just be that little bit tighter on the chest. As I said, with Cooper's press and just bench press as a whole, we're looking for tension throughout the entire range of motion on the way down and on the way up. I think this comes from not just a controlled eccentric, but being super tight on the chest. What I cue people with the eccentric is imagine that your chest is made of glass. When we pause, We don't sink into the chest. It's a nice soft pause on the chest. The bar's still, and that's going to allow for a sturdier position to press from. If the bar is moving when it gets to the chest, it's going to be much harder to press back to the rack for a smooth bench. So if you look at Zoe, everything is great. The lowering phase is controlled, but the tension on the chest is lost just a little bit. So she could just stop a little bit shorter, sometimes just hovering on the chest. You're touching the chest, but hovering as opposed to resting is enough to take someone's bench press from looking pretty good to really good. If you feel that you're struggling with this, tension on the chest, a really, really good secondary bench to program or to include in your program is a long count pause. Something for 2, 3, even 4 seconds on the chest where we can focus on trying to have that tension and holding that position is a really good way of ingraining this pattern. Here we've got my client, Lachie Noble. It is his first week. So his first week doing jumps, he's transitioned from a big SBD focus, trying to get as strong and big as possible, to something a little bit more athletic. So it's his first time doing jumps in a program. The biggest issue I see with people with jumps is not the jump itself. Jumping's fine, jumping's natural. Most people have got no dramas with the jump whatsoever. It's the arms. What we can see with Lachie here is as he jumps forward, he throws his arms back. He's opposing the movement that we're trying to drive. He's trying to jump forward, but move backwards with his arms. So what we want to do with both the broad jump and the vertical jump is feed the jump with the arms. If you're jumping with a broad jump, if you're jumping forward, I would throw the arms forward as well. And that's going to allow you to drive more power, one, into the ground, and then allow you to sort of catch yourself with the landing as well. Let's pull to the vertical. So it's the same thing with the vertical jump. With the vertical, we want to try and use the arms to drive hip flexion, load the hips, load the hamstrings. And then on the concentric, we're going to push through the ground with the legs, but also try and touch the sky. We're feeding the jump with the arms. It's going to allow us to drive just a quicker jump on the eccentric and also more intense on the concentric, on the up phase. So feed your jumps with your arms. Don't oppose the movement, and it will make for a much more powerful jump. Here we've got my client Marcus doing split squats. With a Hatfield split squat variation, I've sort of changed my tune on him a little bit, and I'm leaning away from Marcus is doing actually quite a good job in not using the rack as a assist. He's using it more as a balance, and that's what I want from people with this. Sometimes the issue with using 2 arms as the balance is that it drives a bit more forward lean than I want. Instead, what I recommend people do a little bit more is set up a little bit closer to the rack, use one hand as support, and then try to get the rib cage back. If you're too far away from the support, you've got to lean forward, drive the rib cage forward, leaning, or that lends itself to a more forward lean. We're trying to target quads here. We're probably taking or driving a bit of tension away from the quad. So instead, get a bit closer to the rack, use one hand for support, and then get that rear leg underneath you. I think that's where a lot of people sort of struggle with the split squat and then maintaining position in the split squat. So Marcus here is doing quite a good job of keeping that rear leg underneath him, but because of the support, he's leaning forward, driving his rib cage forward in space, making it harder to hold that position, and then leaning forward a little bit on the way up. In the last video today, we've got my client Nathan going through bench press. Nathan's goal is just trying to get strong. He's trying to get big. He likes the big lift, so we're trying to improve performance here and lift the biggest weights possible. Nathan sets himself up well through his legs, actually got solid leg drive. But what we can do better here is set the upper back. What we need to do, lock the upper back tight, drawing the scaps together and down, but it really is all in the setup. What I recommend people do as they're setting up to get up on the traps rather than just squeezing the upper back together. Get up on the traps, set the highest chest position you can. As you lower your feet down and your butt down, try to, just imagine there's a rope pulling your chest up to the ceiling the entire time. Your chest isn't going to budge, your hips will drop down, your feet will drop down, and this is going to allow for a sturdier or a higher chest position. From here, we're looking to maintain that chest position. What you can see Nathan do on the concentric or the up phase is he reaches forward. That reach forward loses the upper back position, the chest drops down, increasing range of motion, and then just making it that bit harder to press bigger weights. If Nathan said, I don't care about moving the biggest weights possible, I just care about building a big chest, I would say a press like this is actually fantastic and I wouldn't change a thing. But because he wants to move bigger weights, setting that upper back position, getting the chest really high and maintaining that chest position is going to lead to us decreasing range of motion and also moving bigger weights. So this sort of technical analysis is what we do in our check-in process. Sometimes we go a bit more in depth with our clients, provide more context, and just allow for better performance by way of coaching like this in the online service. If this interests you, if you want to get coached by myself, currently I'm working with people looking to improve their body comp, get a bit stronger, get a bit more athletic, or just become the whole package. If that interests you, make sure to get in touch. DM me for coaching, get in contact, and I'm sure we'll sort you out. We now have a public Discord channel for all Strength Culture followers, listeners, viewers. If you want to get your form checked, if you want your technique on any lift reviewed, not just the power lifts, make sure to go to the form check section, drop a video in there, and we'll look to get that sorted in one of these Technique Tuesday videos. The link to the Discord is down below.